In this particular lecture, we're going to deal with a few important issues concerning indigenous knowledge, conservation, sustainability vis-a-vis environment and development. And today we're going to deal with few works which have been carried out by different scholars concerning the debates which are hovering around what is meant by indigenous knowledge, what is meant by local or traditional knowledge, and also how it is different from the Western science or Western knowledge, and thereby how it should be different from the way in which the mainstream or Western notion of development is being carried forward, and thereby taking into considerations about the concerns of indigenous peoples, where in recent times many of the development practitioners wherein policies and various other programs are being framed sort of highlight the urgency of trying to take into considerations about the interests and concerns of the indigenous people. Now, as you can see in the title, we would be pondering upon the issues of what indigenous knowledge is, and also try to engage upon how there is these challenges and or more or less the debates which is concerning to the environment and development issues. Now, of late, many of the development agencies are increasingly sympathetic to the proposition that indigenous knowledge would feature in the planning and implementations of various policies and programs, and they are ever more receptive with the failure of many development projects, the emergence of stakeholders' participation, and also the advancements of policies targeting to the marginalized or those poor communities who depend heavily on indigenous strategies. So, if you looked at the issues or some of the development which have taken place in the past few decades. So the United Nations way back in 1983, under the forum called the World Commission on the Environment and Development, that is the WCED, more importantly or popularly known as the Brundland Commission, sort of tries to engage in looking at or inquiring some of the environmental issues which are being faced mostly in the developing countries. So in that it tries to situate or locate the kind of how the conditions or situations of indigenous peoples across the world, and in its report that is our common feature that is which was given out in 1987, tends to give utmost emphasis and stress the value of traditional knowledge, that is which sought and call upon for the empowerment of the local communities in terms of protections of their land and resource rights. So in some way these are some of the since the colonial period, many of these marginalized or the indigenous peoples have been given or being denied about their rights and accessibility to the use of these resources. So then from the period 1987, with the coming of the the Brundtland Commission's report on our common futures, tends to give utmost importance and felt the urging needs of how indigenous peoples, in some sense, their knowledge or in terms of their how they have been the custodians of this mother earth or nature, or in terms of their sustainable use of natural resources, have been increasingly been realized and then it should be recognize their particular rights and access to these resources. Now, furthermore, the international community further acknowledged that the indigenous peoples actually should come in the forefront, and they should actually play a vital and key part in the sustainable development at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, that is in 1992, which was held at Rio. So, wherein the popular conference or meet, which is known as the Earth Summit. So, in this there is a lot of encouragement in terms of where the indigenous people should actually be given space, or their interest and knowledge in some sense should be given utmost regard, and then thereby they should be made part of these processes. So, if you look further about the Rio Summit, and particularly the Rio Declarations, the Principles 22, it sort of highlights that the indigenous people have to play in the drive for this pursuit of this sustainable development, and indigenous peoples and their communities and other local communities have indeed a vital role in environmental management, and more importantly in development, because of their long existing knowledge and traditional practices, which are interwoven with their surroundings, and more importantly their environment. So therefore, this knowledge system, which has been very much inherent and embedded in their management and the sustainable use of these resources, have been in some sense given utmost importance, and there is an increasing realizations of how the indigenous people have actually a very pivotal and key role to play. So, before going into other details, let's try to familiarize ourselves with what the concept or terminology of what indigenous knowledge is all about. Now, from the works of Allen and Harris, indigenous knowledge is a term that has actually emerged over the last few decades to describe the knowledge of a group of people who are based to a locality that is in geographical space in a given situations, which is sometime again used interchangeably with is also known as the local knowledge. So we should keep in mind that the indigenous knowledge term is being used interchangeably, and there are also scholars who also tends to use the traditional knowledge. So this very concept of indigenous knowledge has of late come to play a very prominent role in contemporary debates on environment. So the indigenous knowledge, when you try to situate or tax in conjunction with the modern technology or Western science, there are actually no fundamental difference or ontological differences between the various bodies of knowledge these categories refer to. So at this point, I just want to go back to the anthropologists. Of course, I'm sure you all must be familiar with by the term by the name called Lévi-Strauss, a French anthropologist, who has actually come up with a very important concept called bricolage in his book The Savage Mind. Now what Lévi-Strauss tries to argue in that particular book is that the knowledge systems which functions in the primitive society and that of the Western society is more or less same. It is in some sense pretty much acceptable and relevant in their own context. Now the bricolier, which is again based on the knowledge system in the primitive society, is loaded with ideas of how people engage in using the available resources in their particular surroundings. So in other words, it is based on the idea of trial and error, and which is pretty much a hand-based or practically driven kind of knowledge. So which means in a primitive society, knowledge is being learned and which has been applied in different contexts, but which has again been very much applicable, and its applications is again based on that particular surroundings. And whereas on the other hand, the Western knowledge system is a textbook, and which is very much contextual again in nature, which is very much loaded with the ideas which is being learned from certain kinds of concepts and theories. So I won't go into detail of that particular debates or how these knowledge systems is being addressed, but if you would like to have a much more or curiosity to know about others, as I said, you might want to refer the book The Savage Mind by Levi-Strauss. Now moving on, from the very instrumentalist point of view, that is the notions of modern technology, that is the rationality of this modern technology, when it is being compared to the indigenous or the local knowledge, cannot be a priori be assumed. So modern technology is always applied in specific social conditions with with a determined to its outcome. Now interestingly, again, indigenous knowledge system, which is pretty much contextual and geographic specific, is again to be understood in terms of its relations or relationship to land, or in other words, their interconnections with land. So the existing studies on the indigenous communities, whether it is in the different parts of the globe, in some way have in common or tends to argues that the very use or this notion of land as the primary medium of the locations of cultural knowledge engenders place-based identity and effective environmental relations, which are not experienced to the same degree by more transient cultural groups. So in other words, we can say that people tends to experience based on their geographical locations, and their knowledge systems again differ across. So you could actually see the kind of connections or the kind of relations people have or establish their knowledge system vis-a-vis land. So one very important point which comes out of this is in this particular argument is that which sort of give an assumption that indigenous knowledge and identity have again specific characteristic and are pretty much contextualized or located in a place, that is in ways that are meaningfully different to the more fluid knowledge and identity constructions of other societies. Now environmentalists have often represented that indigenous groups as ideal models, not only with regards to they share a very intricate relationship, that is a harmony with nature. but also of a social and environment emotional coherence and continuity. So such is the kind of connections which many of these communities share with their immediate surroundings or environment in particular. So therefore, indigenous knowledge systems provide a powerful rationale for their use and as ideal models of a sustainable resource management and also environmental values which integrate human and ecological needs. So one could actually see the interplay and the kind of relationship which are pretty much how the indigenous peoples are, because dependent on their ecology and more generally the ecosystem. So now how do we then try to locate or looked at more critically about the indigenous people's rights vis-a-vis development? So again, as outlined and indicated by the ILO convention, the International Labour Organization Convention 107, the very broader agenda of development included human rights to the extent that integrations of indigenous peoples was supposedly aimed in part at extending to them some socio-economic human rights or second generation rights. Now one can perhaps try to see the way in which how these the indigenous people's rights and development has to be looked into. So again, this very notions is popularized by the report, as I have already outlined, that the World Commissions on the Environment and Development in our common future, the very ambiguities in the concept of sustainable development and sustainable development and its environmental underpinnings contributed to widening the cracks through which indigenous life projects could be actually pursued. So one could say that with the UN's Agenda 21, which provided the framework within which the nation states should pursue the sustainable development of their society into the 21st century, that is reconfigure perceptions of indigenous peoples, was officially sanctioned by the governments and development institutions. So in this perspective, indigenous peoples are given central focus because of, rather than in spite of their cultural differences. So the very role of indigenous peoples and environment is not only the only feature that has changed in the new official visions of sustainable development, because development is no longer the responsibility of the state, rather the state sets within the this wider framework, that is the market must be its motors, and civil society would in some sense give a kind of directions. So the focus of the environment again is important to the indigenous people, in part because it provides a tentative anchor by which their concerns and survival can be articulated with the non-indigenous people's concerns for survival. So in many cases, development projects promoted by the states and corporations mostly on the indigenous territories have important environmental impact that reach well beyond the local settings. Thus, the potential exists on indigenous peoples to gather support on the basis of that it poses a threat to their territories, and survival constitutes a threat or a loss to their people as cultural a group or a cultural identity which are located elsewhere, and a responsibility on the part of those whose lifestyles would benefit from the resources being extracted. Now, if you look at the way in which many of these the UN's agenda, that is, if you look at the chapter 26 of agenda 21, which states that in view of the interrelationship between the natural environment and its sustainable development and the cultural, social, economic and physical well-being of indigenous peoples, national and international efforts to implement environmentally sound and sustainable development should actually be recognized, accommodate, promote and strengthen the role of the indigenous people and their communities. Now, moving on, mostly in the global south, that is, if you look at the works of Ramchandra Guha and Martinez Allaire, that is, in their work, they have actually argued that the fundamental difference between the ecology of affluence and the environmentalism of the poor. So this sort of trust tries to map out the differences between the notions of environmentalism, that is in the global south and global north. The global north being comprising of the developed nations differ from the environmentalism of the poor. So the ecology of affluence is in some way the guiding principles of the northern notions of environmentalism, which is based on the idea of wilderness and appreciating natures for its own sake, which we have at length discussed in our previous lectures. So environmentalism of the poor is again based on notions of issues which relate with lives and livelihoods, which are very much closely related with the natural resources, which the marginalized communities, mostly in the third world countries, have been dependent on day in and day out for their own consumptions, that is in terms of satisfying their basic needs. So the very dominant thrust of environmental movement and the non-governmental organizations among relatively the affluent urbanites, mostly concentrating in the global south, has been the notions of the preservations of wilderness and protections and respect for other species. So as a consequence of which, guided by this ideology and principles, we could actually witness the emergence of the national parks and then the conservations of various species, and also how many of these resources have become protected areas from the touch of human being. So nature is in some way considered to be preserved in its pristine form. So these ideas in some way created a kind of binaries, and it tries to draw the boundaries between human and nature. So in contrast to these very notions or ideas, again the environmentalism of the poor, which constitute the chunk of peasants and the indigenous peoples, is often wrapped up in the problems of the notions of subsistence, that is based on concerns of their everyday livelihoods. So as I have pointed out in the previous classes, we have while dealing with the model on the natural resource management, on the ideas of themes of conservations and livelihood. We have discussed at length about how many of these communities, mostly representing the pigeons and the indigenous peoples, have been dependent on these resources, more important land and forest, or even water, for their own subsistence, that is by collecting the non-timber forest products, or by engaging in fishing, and also for various other purpose, or maybe in terms of engaging in the simple farming. So one could actually see the variance or the kind of differences which is being witnessed over here. So now if we are to looked at from the perspectives of or the paradigms of, or from the discourse of the, by situating that how indigenous knowledge systems or indigenous peoples have to be reflected from or in the development or in the environment development discourse. So first and foremost is that what are the kind of agendas, what are the kind of, what are the priorities which is being based of these communities, that is particularly the indigenous peoples. So across the globe, we could actually see that many of these development policies and programs which are being carried forward mostly are in the territories of these indigenous peoples, or in the global north, that is which consists of the First Nations, have actually of late tends to resist many of these programs. More importantly, because they tend to resist and react to the state and market, and this is carried out with the underlying notions of trying to preserve and also sustain what is understood as the life projects. Now what then is life projects, and how is it different from the mainstream or Western notion of development, or the idea of developmentalism? So life projects are embedded in local histories, and they encompass visions of the world and future, and they are also distinct from those embodied by projects which are promoted by the state and markets. So this is the kind of differences that life projects are again different from what is usually being pushed for or promoted by the state and the market. And life project is also different from development in their attention to the very uniqueness of people's experience of place, that is which is pretty much based on the idea of place based knowledge system, and also the self and their outright rejections of vision which is claimed to be universal by many of the developed nations, or the mostly in the global north. So thus life projects are again on the other hand premise on densely and uniquely woven threads of which consists of landscapes, memories, expectations, and desires. So these very notions of life projects again goes in contrast or antithetical to the development agendas which are again being pushed forward by this. Now mostly the very idea of these development studies have actually tries to in the past few decades tries to look in the way in which how these development have actually benefited or bring a kind of changes in different societies across the globe. But then we also have a point, reach a point that or rather a climax that development actually has become a sort of a U-turn, where development actually has much more negative impacts rather than its positive impacts, in terms of widening the gap between the poor and the rich, the developed and the underdeveloped, and also the marginalized have become much more marginalized, and then it has actually brought utmost inequalities across different societies and different nations in the entire world. Now, how do we then try to look at these debates of the life projects versus development projects? So the very contrast between the indigenous peoples life projects and which is again premised on this place-based perspective, which is in contrast to the universalist visions that sort of tends to justify and shape many of the development projects. Now, how indigenous peoples sort of tries to pursue their life projects against those development projects are actually being done at their own expense, because they are actually the one who have actually need to sacrifice without gaining nothing. So therefore, there is always an increasing and urging needs that why the indigenous people should actually bear the cost when they don't actually get the benefits out of these development projects. So in the context of these emerging structures of governance and again subordination, so one can actually see that how these ideas or these notions of subordinations, or even you could say the hegemonic nature of these development projects are being posited. So how, in spite of the indigenous peoples their willingness in terms of voluntarily trying to give away their land and resources with other users, that is mostly for the development projects, are actually are unwilling to recognize and seek to obscure coexistence. So one can actually see the way in which the aggressive natures or the way in which how these development projects are being pushed forward with the use of violence and with the forcible acquisitions of land and resources, or in terms of the very nature of how global land grabbings are actually being played out and then is being exercised and experienced. And the bitter truth is that oftentimes it is the indigenous people who actually bear the brunt of all these exercise, and then the very nature of how the politics of land acquisitions and then several others are actually being played out. Now, how do we then try to look at development and life projects? Now, interestingly, from the various studies which are being made so far, indigenous peoples are often said to be located closer to nature than the modern West. The dynamics of this progress justified the treatments of the natives along with natures as an objects of dominations. That is to say that their life projects are primarily based on the ideas of or notions of social, cultural, and in a broader sense rather than the narrowly strategic. So their life projects are also pretty much place-based, but not limited to a particular local space. So in contrast, development projects are actually being promoted by the market and state state-backed agents, which its claim to political necessities and the greater good and market demands in the context of globalizations appears to be, disengaged from what is seen in the indigenous people, that is the place conditions. So development as a practice and discourse actually embodies the European Enlightenment, which is implicit project of making specific local worldviews and values, those which are broadly described as modern and Western European into universal or universalism. So the worldviews and values of modernity that are actually promoted by the development are again taken to be, disembedded from place and made entirely abstract and equated ultimately with the global, thus situating life projects in contrast to development requires a discussions of place and how it is actually related to the politics and epistemology implicit in the ideas of that of the local and the global. So place actually is being grounded, that is, place is and emergence on the specific everyday engagement of the specific peoples with specific landscapes, environments, or even nature. So the emergence of modernity in some sense has been marked by a persistent blindness to connections and hybridity, not only between nature and society, but also between the vertical and horizontal threads that make up what concerns as a place. So development as again a project happens to be something that privileges the horizontal threads, which is hegemonic, and other place-based projects appear by contrast as favoring the vertical threads, making up places, identities, and traditions. So what is evident from our discussions so far is vis-a-vis, the indigenous peoples and development, is that two important threats can actually be seen in terms of shaping the places. So vertical threats again refers to those links and connections that ground place in the specific histories and landscapes, whereas horizontal threats refers to the trans-place linkages in more spatial sense. So Deborah McGregor in her study points out that traditional indigenous knowledge, which is critical to the indigenous identity making, emerges not only from a particular history of engagement with landscape, that is, the notions of how people have over the years tends to create a history with the kind of landscape they are being sharing a close relationship with, that is which is known as the vertical threads, but also from forms struggled that indigenous peoples sustain with the newcomers, that is the outside or the external threats such as the development projects, which is again market and state driven forces, are actually being resisted by the indigenous people. So Deborah actually further argues that framing the indigenous peoples and their knowledge within the dichotomous term of modernity actually amounts to losing the richness and complexity of their life projects, which also include the ingrained criticism of power asymmetries and also the possibilities they can offer for the survival of creation. So now what actually is creation from the indigenous people's perspective is something which needs to be taken into account, because the creation history or the very notions of how the reverence to this nature is bestowed upon by the indigenous people is something which needs to be given the utmost significance here. So life projects to a large extent actually aimed at transforming the structures of power that actually constrained indigenous peoples to actually act and live according to the criteria of being indigenousness. That is, they have that have no regard for their own ways of conceiving themselves and their being in the world. So according to one anthropologist by name called von Bremen, way back in 1987, indigenous peoples of the in his study of the Chaco display the moral ecology of the hunter gatherers society, since they live in harmony with nature and gather whatever nature has already produced without transforming it or rather appropriating it. So that actually do not really harm the natural ecosystem. Thus, in contrast to that, development projects have actually failed because they have tried to transform people, that is in terms of commodifying or seeing nature from a utilitarian or a market oriented perspective. So the hunter gatherers actually do not engage in transforming or harming the natures. So one could actually see the binaries or the differences in terms of, on the one hand, the development projects which are being initiated in terms of transforming people who do not actually transform nature into people who transform it, that is by activities such as agriculture and then so on and so forth. So according to the another anthropologist, John Renzo, the moral economy of these hunter-gatherers is actually revealed by the indigenous peoples, their notions of maintenance or management of mechanism which is based on a generalized reciprocity that sort of determined their cultural preference of wage labor. So these notions of reciprocity, that is caring and nurturing of human and nature. So if you care and then nurture nature, nature will actually pay back, that is in terms of looking after your needs. So that sense of reciprocity or reciprocal relationship is being witnessed in many of these indigenous communities. Now, if we are again trying to look at the traditional ecological knowledge and sustainable development. So traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge, as we have already discussed, have increasingly been viewed as a sort of a viable alternative to the status quo that cause problems in the very first instance. Therefore, traditional ecological knowledge has received increased attention over the last couple of decades, particularly in the area of sustainable development. So although there are various protocols, that is for instance the Convention on Biodiversity, that promote and encourage the recognitions of utilizations of traditional ecological knowledge as an integral part of which is moving towards sustainability. There has been actually little evaluations of the methods which is being implemented to achieve this sustainable feature. So, what does sustainable development mean? I mean, from the Western perspective and the indigenous perspective. So, from the Western perspective, sustainable development is a concept which is derived from the conventional Western ideology. It is a product of a particular worldview, and its interpretation and implementation reflect Western culture and values. So, which is based on this notion of Western culture and values. So, though it is again being posited as a framework for addressing various challenges which is being encountered the world over, these challenges and their solutions are defined from the gates of the Western science or the Western conceptions, or from the Western lens. So, throughout the history of colonialism, indigenous peoples have actually been dispossessed of their lands, and they are actually being subjected to policies aimed at developing them, or we could say that the Western based on the Western civilizational mission, or based on the Western civilizational discourse, which of course has caused enormous negative impact, or rather devastating effects, not in terms of their laws and controls of or access to resources, but also in terms of their social and cultural, or the breakdown of their economy, more importantly subsistence economy, and thereby the many of these indigenous peoples are often been perceived as being uncivilized, barbaric, and which has to actually be tamed and be civilized from the Western culture and values. So, sustaining this kind of development may indeed be counterproductive so far as the indigenous peoples are concerned. Now, what does development again mean from the indigenous peoples perspective? From an indigenous perspective, there are no doubt superficial similarities between the indigenous views of sustainable development to that of the Western society. Now, as I had pointed out that the very notions of creation again is important from the indigenous people's point of view. So, creation stories provide a fundamental understanding of indigenous people's place in the world. How do they position themselves? How do they see themselves? Now, from a Western civilizational discourse, which is highly based on the notions of anthropocentrism or anthropocentric ideas, that human is being positioned at the center of the universe, that is, they are actually having or they have this mastery over nature. They are at the center of the universe or nature. Whereas on the other hand, the various teachings and lessons which are again learned from the indigenous peoples are based on the very notions of how they relate to their creation. So they are on one sense based on the idea of biocentric or biocentrism, that is, they tend to see themselves as a part of nature rather than above nature or outside the nature. So there is a holistic way or the intrinsic nature of their close relationship with various other species is being witnessed from the indigenous people's notions or ideas of creation. So a concept or construct such as what we understood as environment, traditional ecological knowledge, or say sustainable development for the indigenous people are assumed to have an automatic affinity, which cannot be really differentiated from human and nature, or maybe which cannot be seen to be an isolated ideas or objects. So therefore it becomes pretty much apparent that the indigenous views of development are again based not on the practice or ideas of giving. Indigenous peoples rather ask themselves what they can give to the environment and their relationship with it. So one can actually see that it is not based on the ideas of giving, rather, but it is also what they can actually give from their perspective. So the very idea of sustaining, maintaining and enhancing relations with all of the creations is again utmost importance from the indigenous points of view, and therefore indigenous ways of life give utmost importance and focuses on this type of relationship with their with the creations. So indigenous peoples understand that this very special personal relationship which they share with the creations comes with a tremendous responsibility, and it is not something which should be totally ignored or taken lightly, and creation is again regarded as something which is a gift, that is a gift of nature. That is, to be sustainable means to take responsibility to be and be spiritually connected with all of the creation and of all of the time, that is which is continuous, which is cyclical, and which is against the idea of Western notions of linear or the ideas of evolutions. So therefore everything and everyone and everything carries these responsibilities and duties, and has duties to perform, what they should do and what they shouldn't, and all things contribute to the sustainability of creation. As we had discussed the way in which how sustainable development has been understood from the Western perspective as well as from the indigenous perspective. So indigenous perspective or notions of development is in some way based on the idea of how relations are being maintained with the creation, that is which is given utmost importance, and from the way in which how this relationship with the creation is given utmost focus and important. So this personal or special relationship with the creations in some sense has come along with a lot of responsibility, that is not simply by the notions of how one has to really engage in a responsibility and also be ultimately spiritually connected with the to all forms of creation and across a perennial period of time. So everyone and everything in some sense tries to engage in caring or carries a responsibility and has duties to perform, and all things contribute to the sustainability of creation. So since the period of colonization, the indigenous peoples resources, or maybe let's say ability to live up to the responsibility of creating or caring for all creation has been seriously inhibited. So the sustainability of the indigenous people's lives has been to a large extent compromised in every aspects of their everyday life, resulting in the loss of lands and also different other problems such as health issues, so and so forth. So one can actually see that with the coming of colonizations, there has been many oppressive forces into play, and it has been so little to the indigenous peoples that they also tends to change their behavior or attitudes towards nature, that is and in terms of being respectful and harmful to the creation. So therefore one can say that indigenous views and notions of sustainable developments are also connected with the notion of giving rather than taking. So and with that they have sort of like hold the belief that we can in some sense contribute to the creation. So therefore indigenous views also include an active resistance sometimes to sustainable development itself, and also the process of reclaiming their traditions. Now it is also important at this point to know that how people must learn to sustain environmental resources so that they continue to provide benefits to them and also other living things, and also the larger environment which they are being part of it, or their connections to with the natural surroundings. So the dominant definitions of sustainability and sustainable development do not, despite some claims, actually propose to replace the status quo. It is simply the slowing down of the very same old agenda. So the purpose of sustainable development is to enable future generations to continue indefinitely with the same exploitative practices that have caused the problems which we face across the world at this point of time. So it is actually based on the notion of economic growth or development and a particular world order. So sustainable development does not challenge the power imbalances between indigenous and Western nations in a meaningful way. So it does not really empower the indigenous nations. So even though the Brundland report did recognize the value of indigenous knowledge as a source of knowledge for moving towards sustainable development, such recognitions was still framed within the dominant Western agenda. So the conventional concept of sustainable development also tends to perpetuate between tension between the environmental and economic aspects. Now let's move on to what traditional ecological knowledge is all about, by basing on few scholars who have been closely working on it. Now the knowledge which the indigenous peoples have shared for generations, that is in relations to the environment, has often come to be referred as the traditional environmental knowledge, or in short it is called the TEK. So Martha Johnson have given vivid explanations or definitions about TEK as follows, that is body of knowledge which is built by a group of people, not individuals, but by a group of people through generations, or by constantly engaging or living in close relationship with nature. So this close contact with nature is again very much important. So it also includes a systems of classifications, that is a set of empirical observations about the local environment. So how people have been closely observing and also at the same time practicing, not simply merely as a non-participant observer, but rather as a participant observer, I mean in the local setting or environment, and a system of self-management that governs resource use. So the quantity and quality of traditional environmental knowledge varies among different community members, which can be set across and then differs depending upon the gender, age, social status, the intellectual capability, and also profession, which includes like the people who engage in hunting or spiritual leader who have been a vast knowledge about the natural surroundings. So with its roots firmly in the past, that is in the past successive generations, traditional environmental knowledge is both cumulative and dynamic, that is which is built upon the experience of earlier generations and again adapting to the new technological and socio-economic changes of the present. So we are in some sense familiar with what traditional environmental knowledge is based on the definitions given by Martha Johnson's. Again, another definitions which is given by Gleb Regorodetsky in Weeks in Elders, that is, knowledge is regarded as inseparable from the land. That is how knowledge is pretty much interrelated with the land and forest. When we talk about land, it also includes the forest and water resources as well. So the very term land is not necessarily restricted to the physical environment only. It has rather a much broader meaning, that is which is being used by the indigenous people, which refer to the physical, biological and spiritual environment. So when it includes the physical, the biological and the physical spiritual environment, which are being fused together. So the closest scientific equivalent of land taken without its spiritual component is what is known as the ecosystem. So Regorodetsky also observed that the spiritual and the ethical values have been woven into this knowledge system, by thereby creating a system that has actually guided and helped people in their everyday life to survive out of these procedures or processes. Now further, Alfred states that the indigenous belief system or which in fact reflect spiritual connections, that is with the land, which is established by the creator who creates almost everything on this earth. So it also gives human beings special responsibilities within the area which they had actually inhabited or occupy as indigenous peoples, linking them to a kind of natural way to their territories. So, traditional knowledge in some sense is a practical common sense, like what I have mentioned of how Levi-Strauss was trying to explain the very concept bricolier or bricolage that is based on the practical common sense, and it is also based on good reasoning and a logic which is built on experience. So therefore, it is in some sense an authority system that is a standard of conduct and also setting out rules governing the use and respect of resources. That is, the notions of nurturing and caring is being witnessed or reflected on this. It is not simply about using it and dumping away, or simply ignoring the well-being of the other creation. And also it is based on the idea of an obligation to share, that is where things are being not consumed necessarily by an individual, but it is communally shared, and then the benefits of resources are actually being shared across different individuals. So therefore, the very notion or the idea that is built, that is the wisdom, comes in again using the knowledge and ensuring that it is being used in a positive way or in a good way, or maybe let's say for the well-being of the community in general, or maybe both the entities that is human in nature. So it also involve using both the head and the heart together. So it in some sense involves a humanistic approach to this. So traditional knowledge in that sense is pretty much dynamic and yet stable, and also usually shared in their stories, songs, dance, and also myths. So we will be discussing these more in detail in our upcoming lectures. So now coming to what actually is the problems which is actually being encountered, that is the barriers in terms of the use of these traditional environmental knowledge with regards to sustainable development. So the barriers to this traditional environmental knowledge use also include in some sense the cultural disruption that has actually occurred in Aboriginal communities as a consequence of the colonization which have taken place almost across the globe, and then particularly among the indigenous communities. Now what from the works of Camp and Brooke, they tend to summarize the issue as follows. So one of the important lessons which is being learned is that indigenous peoples must first engage in control their own information, that is their knowledge system, and the way in which how they have this control and access to these resources. Now it has also become pretty much clear over the years that knowledge based on the indigenous peoples is pretty much vital, dynamic, and also evolving. So therefore, merely engaging in documenting or collecting the indigenous environmental knowledge is in fact pretty much counterproductive in nature, because this knowledge system has been under a tremendous attack for centuries, and also the social system that in some sense support them has been seriously undermined by various organizations and agencies, particularly the Western science. However, indigenous people does not just support salvage operations of what now is often referred to as rapidly disappearing knowledge base. Now, one can also see that how this very notion of the individual, that is, it is not simply based on the idea of or recovery or recording of this indigenous knowledge, or it is in some sense respect and revitalizations. This information has to actually remain current and not really be considered as a relic past. So, one of the again the difficulties which is being experienced in utilizing the traditional environmental knowledge in the environmental impact assessment lies in the environmental scientist dilemma, that is, traditional knowledge, although or in spite of its evidence strength, pretty much corresponds poorly when it comes to the Western intellectual ideals of truth. So, one way of doing this is that indigenous peoples must also insist that their knowledge not be reduced to an interesting research topic for Western science to explore, because one could actually see that there is unequal power relationships and impact on the utilizations of traditional environmental knowledge with regards to environmental resource management is also recognized by other scholars. So, moving on, we can in some way tries to look into how there is requirement or the urging needs of a coexistence, that is to recreate the old relationships. So, traditional environmental knowledge is also about relationships, that is not simply based on the understanding, that is the relationship in creation, but also it is about participating in those relationships, that is to engage with the knowledge system that is to be a part of that resource management. So, traditional environmental knowledge is also about engaging in sustaining a creative reciprocal relationship with all forms of creation, which we have already been familiar, because this is the very notions or the indigenous perspective of what sustainable development is also about, and also about fulfilling our lives and human beings in relations to the creations, which is so eloquently pointed out by Sally. So, from a Western perspective, again, traditional ecological knowledge and sustainable development and sustainability are again discrete concepts. However, from an Aboriginal point of view, they are intimately related and are in fact part of the same continuum or circle, or rather there is no different way of explaining or differentiating between the two. So, therefore, they are mostly about relationships. So, therefore, they are also about relating to creation in a certain way. So, if people do not really engage in taking care of their relations, then they are not actually fulfilling the duties and responsibilities, and they are denying their relationship with creations, and dysfunction will result. So, in a reciprocal relationship, non-human elements are expected to fulfill their relationship or responsibilities to creation. So, traditional teachings normally offer a profound guidance that is about how to really engage in working with the creation, and also not to disturb or interfere with the other beings in terms of their abilities to fulfill their duties and responsibilities. So the model of coexistence is viewed as holding a promise for the environmental and resource management. So coexistence may serve as a potentially promising bridge between the two worldviews, that is the Western and the Aboriginal or the Indigenous worldview. So McGregor and Brubacher actually anticipate that the coexistence approach can function as a starting point for regenerating an old relationship in a contemporary context. So therefore a coexistence approach would in some sense promote a focus on formally acknowledging Aboriginal people as legitimate partners in resource management, and it would also ensure that the rightful place in the development and implementation of management policies and decision making, thereby drawing upon principles which express the values and perspective of both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal cultures. So therefore there is potential for developing an alternative or effective coexistence model, one that bridges distinctions by building upon the shared values. So the coexistence approach does not devalue either Western or Indigenous resource management practices and the knowledge that informs them. So coexistence does not allow for the dominations of one over the other, and both systems are actually valued and most importantly for the Aboriginal people in terms of their cultural survival is being assured. So the Aboriginal worldview and all it has to offer will no longer be threatened, dominated or distorted. So therefore relationship which is based on coexistence, if established or recognized in a broader scale, would greatly facilitate global moves towards the notion of sustainability. Now if we further tries to look into the the knowledge system, that is science and traditional knowledge. Now how do we then differentiate and then look into this? Traditional knowledge is a body of knowledge that is the based on know-how, practices and representations which are maintained and developed by peoples with an extended histories of interactions with the natural environment. So traditional knowledge is embedded within specific worldviews, that is in this very respect the modern science is not different. It is also another anchor in a specific worldview and more to the point a specific view about man's relationship to nature that is strongly based on the idea of instrumental. So in contrast, the worldview which is embraced by the traditional knowledge holders typically emphasizes the symbiotic nature of the relations between the humans and the natural world. So rather than opposing man and nature as which is being guided or the guiding principle in Occidental or Western thought, traditional knowledge holders rather tend to view people, animals, plants and also other elements of the universe as interconnected by a network of social relations and also obligations. So the obligations, again, as we had already discussed, is also about the responsibility of caring and nurturing. Now there is also a term which is being used quite extensively, which is called ethnoscience. So ethnoscience is a scientific approach to traditional knowledge which is based on the work of Harold Kunglint among the Hanuno community in the Philippines way back in the 1950s. So, through elicitations of responses of both the natural objects such as plants, diseases, soils, animals and humans activities such as agriculture, scientists develop an appreciations of the coherence of indigenous knowledge systems, their empirical precision and their attunement to local environmental context. So, as ethnobotany again grew during the period in the 1970s and 80s, so scientific interest increased as well. That is, with contributions not only from the disciplines such as anthropology, but also from the biological systematics, structural linguistics, and so on. So, it should be actually noted that the debates continue on to the extent of universality of classification systems. So, the relationship between scientists and indigenous communities have been criticized by some advocates of the postmodern perspective that emphasize on the hegemonic power relationship embedded in certain forms of knowledge. So, Western science, insofar as it tries to embody cultural constructions that disenfranchise and subordinate the traditional populations, tribal groups and women is viewed as an enemy of the indigenous knowledge that are inherently consistent with the political aims of empowerment and land rights for these groups. So, recently traditional knowledge through the modern ethnobotanical research is informing science in many areas of natural resource management. So, traditional knowledge helps scientists understand management of biodiversity, and traditional knowledge informs science about natural resource management. So, traditional knowledge provides scientific insight into, for example, crop domestications, breeding and also practices of Sweden agriculture, agroecology, agroforestry, crop rotation, so on and so forth. Now, traditional knowledge also has informed modern science in many areas, that is most notably in taxonomy, medicine, agriculture and others. So, agricultural science and natural resource management are being influenced by traditional knowledge through modern ethnoscience research. So, traditional knowledge informs science about the conservation strategies which can be again based on traditional knowledge and resource use. So, it may includes from the activities such as harvesting of individual plant or animal resource to the management of the entire landscapes or ecosystems. So, if we are to situate the local knowledge in the environment development discourse, local knowledge, as we all know, is pretty much based on the practical collective and strongly rooted in a particular location or place. So, according to Clifford Geertz, local knowledge forms a relatively organized body of thought which is based on immediacy of experience. So, in this call for this location specific, ethnoscientists have revealed sophisticated insights and indigenous knowledge systems and worldviews. So, the concept that local people usually produce, that is the shared knowledge, serve as a cultural totem about how we know, that is representations of that particular community which sort of like symbolize their uniqueness, and which also includes an implicit assumptions of people living in close communities and having unique way of knowing. So local knowledge is also often being presumed or perceived to be a non-knowledge. So traditionally scientists and development experts have simply not wanted to see local forms of knowledge as having anything important to say. So scientific knowledge has been defined as a paradigm of knowledge and the only epistemologically adequate ones. So this has in some sense resulted in a view of how local knowledge is perceived as non-knowledge that is based on irrationality and ignorance. So among the development experts that is for instance working in Rio, local knowledge was commonly seen as a constraint on progress, and local settlers are confined by their traditional modes of thinking. However, today there is an increasing number of environmentalists and alternative movement activists criticizing the hegemony of science and thereby emphasizing the necessity of creating space for competing modes of knowledge. So many of them actually asserts that it is actually time to replace the reductionist framework of science with a methodology that draws its guidelines from the non-Western traditions, which is based on holistic ways of knowing and ecologically evolve, learning to live in equilibrium with nature. So Western science has for centuries, beginning from the colonization period, has actually oppressed the rural or the aboriginal people and their traditional knowledge altogether. So instead of considering them as experts, we should actually admit the fact that we are apprentices and we have enormously to learn from the local people. So they know their environment pretty much intricately, and also they have deep knowledge of the local ecosystems. So according to the alternative developmentalist, local settlers were actually a minimal disturbers of nature. That is, they have been sustainably managing and using their resources with utmost care, and admirable scientists of the concrete, which is genuinely unfolding the hidden innards of the local habitats. So Western science was actually constructed as reductionist and theoretical, while the non-Western knowledge was considered more holistic and practical. So these are the references which you might like to further refer when trying to make sense of what indigenous knowledge system is, and trying to position with the challenges with regards to environment and development discourse. Thank you.